What's going on, man? Welcome back to the basement. I'm Ron. I just want to give a happy Father's Day to all the fellas out there that have birthed a child. I know a lot of the demographic of this channel is like older males, 20 plus males, 30 plus males. So if you're out there, you're a father. I hope you're having a fantastic Sunday. But today we're going to talk through my tight end rankings. I did my redraft rankings, my first rough draft of like a top 215 on the Patreon, patreon.com/Ron Stewart. It is live as we speak, but it's also June. So if you don't need redraft rankings, feel free not to check them out. But we're going to go through today and talk through my top 15 tight ends, divide them up into tiers. We did quarterbacks, running backs, wide receivers at this point, and now it's time to finish it off. So with all of that being said, let's talk about some tight ends. It gets kind of disgusting in here, but you have to talk about tight ends at some point. And in like August, I'm probably not going to have the time to talk through my top tight ends again, so why not do it early in the season here? As always, if you learned something new, if you enjoyed the video, make sure down below, subscribe, leave a like. Let's go.
Yes, stones, like this froze, ice cold, ice around my body like I'm frozen, she gon' let me.
Now, as always with these tiers, the tiers matter much more than the individual rankings. The rankings within each tier, you can kind of flip-flop them how you'd like, but these are the tiers that I feel are real and kind of divide up the landscape for fantasy tight ends. And this is going to be for PPR leagues, but it applies to half PPR as well. And instead of doing like S, A, B, whatever tier, we have them listed: elite tight ends, luxury tight end ones, low-end tight end ones, high floor tight end twos, upside tight end twos. And it's really more about not like, tight end 1 through 12 being a tight end 1 per se, just in terms of I'm drafting a team, that tight end's in my tight end spot. Do I feel good if they're in tight end 1? Do I feel good if they're in tight end 2? So with all of that being said, let's talk about our first tight end tier very easily. Tight end 1, Travis Kelce. He is head and shoulders above everybody else. He is tight end 1 in points per game since 2021, so that's over the last 2 seasons, and it's not really even close, right? 17.5 points per game is head and shoulders above the rest. He's a number 1 target in a Mahomes offense, which has been top 3 in pass attempts top 3 in pass attempts since Mahomes entered the league, and leads the league in points per game since Mahomes entered the league. So you got everything going for him. The only concern really here is that he's going to be 34 this season. He has 9 years straight of 15-plus games played, plus like all of these long playoff runs with Mahomes. There's a little bit of concern that age catches up to him and he gets hurt or, kind of falls off a little bit here. But it's tough because he has that huge added floor of being attached to Mahomes in a really good offense. The only nitpick I'll have with Kelce is it happens every time he has one of these like amazing years, right? It happened after, I think 2020 was the last one that was like 18-plus points per game and he really killed it. His ADP the following year is really tough to stomach. Like, he's a top 6 pick on Underdog right now. Which is really tough to take a 34-year-old tight end, over guys like Stephon Diggs, Bijan, Eckler. It's tough. It's tough, but when we're talking about just strictly tight ends, he is that guy. Now, I do want to say, we'll be bringing up Underdog ADP in this video. Make sure you check out Underdog Fantasy. Use promo code RON. If you're new to Underdog Fantasy, it is a fantasy football platform website. It is the best out there. You draft your team. And the beauty of best ball, I get questions all the time, what the hell is best ball? It sets your best lineup every week. I have over 200 teams drafted for 2023, and when the season comes around, I will have to set waivers, make trades for none of them. Sets the best lineup every week. You draft it, you forget about it. At the end of the year, you either win money from tournaments, leagues you're in, whatever, but you don't have to deal with it week to week. You can get in here, draft, do the fun part. The most fun part of fantasy football is the draft, so you can kind of just spam the drafts without the added baggage of then controlling that team. So use promo code RON when you sign up. I'll have a link down below in the description and a link in the comments below. You click it, it'll take you to Underdog Fantasy. It'll put my promo code RON in, and it'll match your first deposit up to $100. Now, our tight end 2 here, also I'll put in this tier. Now, these are elite tight end 1. So these are the only guys that I feel comfortable with where if I draft this tight end, I have an elite advantage at the position, and that's Mark Andrews. Kelce and Andrews, the only 2 guys in this tier. Now, people might be hesitant to put Mark Andrews in the tier with Travis Kelce after last year, but I think we kind of need to have I think we need to be a little bit nicer to what Mark Andrews did in 2022. It's still the tight end 3 in points per game. Wasn't great, but you also have to remember that he played 15 games last year. 10 of those 15 games with Lamar. So we had 5 games without Lamar. The games with Lamar, he was at 14.48 points per game as opposed to 9.1 points per game. And that 14.5 points per game was on pace for like 88 catches, 1,022 yards, 8 touchdowns. Through those first 12 weeks before Lamar Jackson got hurt on the back 5, Mark Andrews was a tight end 2. He had a full 2 point per game over the next tight end in fantasy scoring. He wasn't quite Kelsey, but he was a big advantage at the position, and that was in a pretty terrible situation where the Ravens have still had Greg Roman, where last year you can see the pass attempts, they were 28th in pass attempts, 22nd in neutral pace. So you're not only a low-volume pass attempt offense, but you're a low-pace offense. You're not even getting your plays up, right? So if your tendency is to run the ball a bunch and then also not push the tempo, you're just going to have a really low-volume offense across the board. But that should change a little bit here. We have Todd Monken coming in, of course. When you have Lamar Jackson, you're not going to be top 5 in pass attempts. It's just not how it works. I mean, top 5 in dropbacks would still be tough, but I think that you could make the case that they'll probably flirt with like top 10 in dropbacks, probably like 15 to low 20s in raw pass attempts. But as you can see, I mean, outside of 2021, which was Mark Andrews' best year, but that also came with Lamar getting hurt. Huntley came in and that kind of fluctuated the pass attempts. If we could get an offense here that is somewhere between like 10 to like 18 in pass attempts, which you would think with Todd Monken that probably happens here. He's going to push the pace. The whole offense should be better. Mark Andrews is going to be the number 1 target on an offense that is going to promote and allow Lamar Jackson to actually pass the ball, jack up the pass attempts, push the tempo a little bit, which is really exciting, especially when you have, guys like Zay Flowers and hopefully a healthy Rashad Bateman kind of taking pressure out of the middle so that Andrews can kind of get open down the seam. Now, when we move off from this tier, we have your luxury tight end 1s. Now, these are still like high-end tight end 1s, but they're not quite elite, and it doesn't really feel good to draft any of these guys because, I mean, it's one of the, it's up there with like late-round quarterback as one of the more known strategies in fantasy football, but you really either want the elite guys up top or you just want to forego the position entirely and just take like 2 streamers later, because we do see late round tight ends work out every single year, and we do see middle round tight ends not work out every single year. Like Darren Waller was a disaster last year. Kyle Pitts was a disaster last year. George Kittle wasn't terrible. He's going to be our tight end 3 here. He didn't have an amazing season, but he was fine. Like if we look over his entire career, or since 2018, he's yet to finish outside of the top 4 tight ends in points per game. He was a tight end 2 last year with 11 receiving touchdowns. He somehow finds a way to get really nice efficiency. Either that's on yards after the catch, either that's on touchdowns. He just is a really good player at giving you more than he's expected when it comes to points per game. And something else that he gives you, George Kittle, is massive spike weeks, which is huge at tight end because he is giving you week-winning weeks, where over the last 2 years, he is second behind just Kelsey and Andrews in 20-plus PPR point games. 7 is pretty crazy. It's a pretty huge tier gap from Kittle to Schultz, Hawkinson, Goddard. Your only tight ends that are actually like giving you massive spike weeks are Kelsey, Andrews, Kittle, and then it's a huge fall off. And that's pretty much the biggest reason why I'll have Kittle over a guy like Hawkinson, who we'll talk about in a second. But Kittle gives you massive spike weeks, huge upside. Hawkinson you could probably pencil him in for more receptions and more targets, but I do want a guy that can just give me, 25 points in like week 14 and win me a playoff matchup, right? That's something that is in Kittle's wheelhouse, and he does it time and time again every season, where he'll just rip off a crazy game because his efficiency ceiling knows no bounds. Now, tight end 4, we have TJ Hawkinson. This is probably where he has to be. I don't love him. He's yet to have like a true difference-making tight end season. Like I don't think that he's averaged over 13 points per game over an entire season. I will say, once he got to Minnesota last year, he was like a hair over 13 points per game. But he can compete with Kittle's spike weeks. But again, tight end 4 is where I'll have him because I think after these top 3, Hawkinson's really the next guy you have to sort of pencil in there. If we look at last year, he was tight end 2 in expected points per game, which that's the EP, right? Expected points, 13 expected points per game. Expected points is just based on your targets, your ADOT, the volume that you command, how many points should you have put up on a per-game basis. He was at 13, which is pretty good, right? That was more than Andrews, and that was a lot more than Kittle. It's just that Kittle outperforms his output by a lot, right? 3.4 FPOE, the best on this list. Now, with Hawkinson, He's not super sexy. Maybe he like Zach Ertz his way to like a huge year where he can just rack up catches, but it's going to be tough if Jefferson's in front of him. But he's on a Vikings offense who was third in pass attempts per game last year, eighth in points scored. It's a good offense. He should be the second target on what should be a pretty prolific offense. They traded for him. They kind of treat him as like a cornerstone of their offense down the stretch. I think on the play that they might have lost to the Giants, like the playoff game in the wild card round, I think that it was a TJ Hawkinson target that everybody was up in arms about. Maybe it was before the first down marker. But yeah, I'm not sure he'll ever be efficient enough to give you like a tight end 1 overall ceiling. But there's only so low you can put TJ Hawkinson because he's going to probably finish in the top 5 tight ends. It's probably just going to be tight end 3 through 5 instead of like a massive ceiling there. Now, the last tight end we'll have here, our tight end 5, is going to be Kyle Pitts. People are going to feel burned about him. He feels like the opposite of Hawkinson, where I think that Pitts has a low floor and a really high ceiling, and you kind of just have to embrace that when you pick him. His fantasy finishes haven't really been there yet, right? He hasn't really given you a great season yet, but what he has given you is a lot to think about in terms of how good he's been thus far through his career. The touchdowns haven't been there, right? You see he's only had 3 touchdowns so far through his first 2 years, but on a yards per game basis in his first 2 years, he is in pretty elite company here. Like this is since 2000. By the way, I bought, there's like a separate thing on Pro Football Reference, StatHead. We're going to be using that a lot more. I love that I can just kind of like look through and see historically like your leaders in yards per game among tight ends in their first 2 years since 2000. So these are tight ends year 1 and 2 in terms of yards per game ranked. You have Kittle, Shockey, Gronk, Jimmy Graham, Aaron Hernandez, Kellen Winslow, Kyle Pitts, Travis Kelce, Evan Ingram, Jordan Reed, Mark Andrews, Antonio Gates. That is a star-studded list. Like every single one of those guys has had a pretty good fantasy season. A lot of them, like, you know, your Kittles, Gronks, Jimmy Grahams, Kelce's of the world, have been studs of the position forever. But this is just to show that the touchdowns haven't been there. He got hurt in his second year. But in terms of yards per game, Pitts has been elite to start his career, which I just think is a good sign, just given the fact that we know who he was coming into the league, right? Like 5th overall, 4th overall, top 5 pick in the NFL draft, which was just absolutely unheard of. I think he went 5th overall. I don't know why I was flip-flopping there. Or actually, he might have gone. I think he went 4th over Jamar Chase, which is pretty crazy. But I might be misremembering that. Regardless, though, great prospect, freak athleticism. Just the fantasy points haven't been there because the touchdowns haven't really been there. But in terms of yards per game, he's been an absolute monster. He led all tight ends in targets per out run last year, so he's commanding targets. He's just been in a bad offense and has been unlucky in the touchdown department. But if we look at all of the tight ends from this list and we see what they did in year 3, so I took their average year 1 and 2 yards per game, right? That's what we just looked at. And then I took their year 3 points per game. So, right, in their third season, what was their fantasy points per game? And what would that have ranked in 2022, right? So last year. And we look through, and a lot of them have great seasons in year 3. I mean, some of them not so much, like, you know, Kelce, Jeremy Shockey in year 3, Mark Andrews in year 3 wasn't great. But still, all of those guys would have been top 7 tight ends in points per game last year. And I have Kyle Pitts at tight end 5, so that's not terrible. And the average tight end on this list averaged 14.5 points per game, which would have been the tight end 2 last year. So I know that Kyle Pitts is in a terrible situation, but just based on talent and what he's done through 2 years, historically it's been a good bet for these tight ends in year 3 to put up like a tight end 2 through like 7 at worst season here. And I think Kyle Pitts has that upside. But again, the issue here, offensive environment, if it wasn't for like the Falcons and Arthur Smith, Pitts would pretty easily be tight end 3 for me in redraft, but I have him at this point. They led the NFL in rush attempts last year. They were the 6th slowest neutral pace team, Atlanta. You're kind of hoping things regress to the mean, right? They saw more pass attempts when Desmond Ridder was in the game as opposed to Marcus Mariota. So things can come forward, and even if not, Kyle Pitts could just be a red zone target who also just commands like a 28 or 29% target share and can kind of get home that way. But like I said, low floor, high ceiling. I also want to say that you can be down on the Falcons offense, and Pitts can score like less than London in points per game, or like just as much points per game as Drake London, but be more impactful, right? Like last year, Michael Pittman was the wide receiver 23 in points per game, but that would have been the tight end 2 in points per game. So if you think Drake London and Kyle Pitts are both going to produce similarly, then Kyle Pitts is probably a good pick per ADP. Remember, like his what he has to clear to be useful in fantasy is a lot lower than a guy like Drake London, who I like as a fantasy pick as well. But for him to pay off, he probably needs like 16 plus points per game. Kyle Pitts can kind of get there with like 12.5 or better points per game. So just something to remember when you're talking through Pitts versus London. Now, when we talk about our next tier, we have our tight end ones who are still guys where if I'm drafting a team in like a redraft managed league and I draft one of these tight ends, I'm probably not taking a second one to like stream or for bye weeks. I'll probably just take one off waivers when the bye week comes to me. And at tight end 6, we have Darren Waller here. Darren Waller had a pretty brutal year last year, like probably his worst year yet. 9.4 points per game was the first time he's finished outside of the top 6 in points per game since he finally got like a full-time gig with the Raiders in 2019. But I think you can kind of explain it away by like injury and then also Josh McDaniels. We look at his game logs, and he missed 7 games with a hamstring injury that I believe started in Week 5. That game in Week 5, counting towards his points per game, screws him up. He only played 10% of the snaps. But the snap shares altogether are really weird. He ended up with a 58.8% snap share in his games played. The 3 years before that, he was at 80%, 90%, 90%. So instead of those, he was at 58.8%. And again, those are in the games that he was playing. And I think that it kind of ties into injury, right? Like after Week 5, he was never over 65% of the snaps. Even before that, like 57.4% in Week 2. He had some weird stuff in the preseason where it was like, is he holding out because of injuries? Is he holding out because of his contract? And then he had the weird stuff with McDaniels where him and McDaniels weren't getting along. And then he ended up getting traded because McDaniels like leaked his wedding stuff. So I just think that it was a bad marriage with this new McDaniels coaching regime that came in. And I'm very excited for the bounce back with him on the Giants, because now he ends up on the Giants, which is a perfect spot. Brian Dable runs a beautiful offense. He always gets his playmakers involved. He showed last year that even with like no weapons, he could still, command a really strong offense last year. You bring in Darren Waller. They trade a third for him, which is massive draft capital, right? That's more than like the Browns traded for Amari Cooper. That's more than the Browns traded for Elijah Moore. Is a third round is probably more than the Cowboys traded for Brandon Cooks. So I mean, it's a pretty big investment there. And you have a spot with the Giants where there's really no one around him. And I think Andrew Cooper puts this the best, right? He has a thing that he talks through every offseason where he talks through tight ends. Andrew Cooper at Coupe Fiasco, which I think is a play on Lupe Fiasco, is one of the guys that I look at on Twitter that I think actually knows what he's talking about when it comes to tight ends. But he's always really high on tight ends needing to be top 2 targets in their offense. So he said when we look at the tight ends that finish top 5 without being a top 2 target on their team, the results are equally scarce. You have our best. You have Robert Tonyan and Martellus Bennett. So in the last 7 years, you have, 35 top 5 tight ends. Of those 35, only 2 of them haven't been a top 2 target on their offense. So essentially what you want is you want your tight end to be a top 2 target on your offense. It doesn't mean, hypothetically top 2 target. It means when you count the raw targets at the end of the year, you want your tight end to be second at worst. And I think Waller has a pretty huge chance here to be second, even first, in targets on this Giants team. Like when we look here, Mike Clay's projections has him at 100 targets. Your next highest is Saquon at 73, and then Hodgins at 69, Paris Campbell at 69. So Waller is set up to absolutely smash this year, where he could lead this Giants offense in targets, be the main receiver, get moved around the formation by Brian Dable. We have, outside of last season, we have 3 years of data of him being a very good fantasy tight end. So I will be scooping up all of him at this discounted price. Now, after that, we have Dallas Goedert. And Goddard's a tough one for me to really love at tight end 7. The issue for Goedert has been volume, right? At first, he was splitting time with Zach Ertz, and then last year he wasn't splitting time with Zach Ertz, but he was competing for targets with Devonta Smith and A.J. Brown in kind of a low target ceiling offense. He has never been top 6 in expected points per game. He has never been top 6 in target share at tight end. He's never been top 6 in targets per out run. It's just tough. Devonta Smith and A.J. Brown accounted for 56% of the targets last year, both clearing 27% or higher. So it's tough to see Dallas Goedert really get in there unless the Eagles were to pass more, which I don't really think is going to happen. Their defense only got better. So it's going to be tough for Dallas Goedert to have enough. I mean, he has contingent ceiling where he's almost like a handcuff to A.J. Brown and Devonta Smith, where if one of those guys went down, Dallas Goedert would definitely smash there. But I guess what you can sort of hang your hat on here is this offense going to be efficient. It's going to be high scoring. They were the 3rd highest scoring team last year. And Dallas Goedert is a talented player and an efficient player. He was 4th in PFF grade last year. He was tied for 1st in yards after the catch per reception. He was 4th in yards per out run. He's super talented, super efficient. It's just tough because the volume isn't really where you need it to be for him to truly make a difference at this point. Like, you kind of need an injury to get there, which is the problem. Now, I will say he's really efficient, but he didn't really hit the jackpot in the touchdown department at any stage in his career yet. So if he was to be efficient and then he added on like 10 touchdowns somehow, which I think would be pretty crazy, but maybe that's in his range. If that happens, I think that maybe that's how he gets to, like, being a huge advance rate, huge win rate type player. But it is tough to see. Only 3 receiving touchdowns last year. So again, if he had like 10, he would have scored a lot more points, but it's hard to pencil him in for 10 in an offense with A.J. Brown, Devonta Smith, the QB sneak cheese that they'd be doing with Jalen Hurts as well. Now, after that, we have our low-end tight end ones. So these are low-end tight end ones that you can draft another tight end with them in managed leagues. You don't have to, but we're right on the fringes here. And at tight end 8, we have David Njoku. David Njoku finished as the tight end 8 in points per game last year, despite picking up he had a high ankle sprain in like week 7. He had a knee sprain in week 12. He was banged up all over the place, which has kind of been the story with David Njoku in his career, which kind of sucks. But he was a tight end 8, which kind of feels like his floor last year in a bad passing game offense in Cleveland, and only just 4 receiving touchdowns last year. He hasn't really been a red zone threat in his career, but tight ends naturally kind of find themselves in the end zone, and touchdowns aren't sticky year to year, right? We've seen Ebron have like 10, I think 12 with the Colts one year, and then the next year probably less than 6. Similar thing happened with Hunter Henry last year, where in 2021 he was an absolute stud from a touchdown perspective. Then the next year he scores less than 5. So Njoku probably gonna be second or third on the targets, depending how you feel about Elijah Moore on this Browns offense. Deshaun Watson should take a step forward. I've been talking, the last month and a half all over the place that the Cleveland Browns are an offense I want to bet on taking a step forward. It seems like Stefanski wants to pass the ball more. Deshaun Watson, his career averages in terms of efficiency and touchdown rate would suggest that what he did last year should really regress to the mean and become a lot better from an efficiency standpoint, which means all the passing game options in this offense, if they were good last year, they should be great in 2023, which is how I feel about David Njoku. Now, at tight end 9, we have Evan Ingram, who is pretty meh, or no, he wasn't pretty meh. What I'm trying to say is I loved him last year. I drafted a ton of him last year, but now I feel kind of meh about where he goes at this point. He's like an 8th round pick at this point. He finished tight end 7 in points per game last year. The issue with him is it was just very clear last year that he was a great late round pick, right? Outside of the top 10 rounds in ADP, you draft him. He's always been a guy that commands volume. The issue is that he's kind of like a low A-dot target vacuum is kind of his archetype, where last year he was 14th in yards per route run. This is among tight ends, 29th in A-dot, but he was 3rd in catches with 73, and that's kind of his upside. But the issue is he was 3rd in targets last year, and now you add Calvin Ridley to the mix. So you're probably looking 4th in targets. I mean, depending how you feel about Zay Jones, maybe you think Evan Ingram out snaps Zay Jones, but I think it's going, or out targets Zay Jones, but I think it's going to be really close at the least. And you also have the Jaguars, who spent a 2nd round pick on Brenton Strange, a new tight end, after trading for Dan Arnold midseason last year. And I think it just kind of points to Doug Peterson liking his 2 tight end sets, right? We've seen him do it with Goddard and Ertz. We've seen him do it with Zach Ertz and not Tim Burton. Was it Michael Burton? It was something Burton, the kid from Florida that played quarterback. And I think he was out there for the Philly special. He had a couple years, and then he was also the Kansas City offensive coordinator back when they had Kelsey and then Anthony Fasano as well. Anthony Fasano used to be a featured part of that offense a little bit. At least Evan Ingram is tied to Trevor Lawrence in what should be a top 10-ish offense, definitely top 10 in pass attempts. So that's really interesting. It just feels like he's priced right at where he should be, or a little bit higher than that. He's no longer a discount like he was last year. Now, after that, we have tight end 10. Last tight end in this tier, we have Pat Freiermuth, who's probably a better player than Evan Ingram, but it's tough to put him much higher in this Matt Canada offense on the Steelers. You're going to be behind Deontay Johnson and probably behind George Pickens in targets. Could make the case that he might be behind Najee Harris in targets if things go Najee Harris's way. Probably not, though. And Mike Clay has this offense projected 26th in passing yards and 21st in scoring, led by Kenny Pickett. Now, I don't have a ton of faith in this offense. I mean, the offense has a lot of upside is what I'll say, right? If Kenny Pickett takes a huge step forward, then this offense can really pay off. I just don't really have a lot of faith in Kenny Pickett. But with Freiermuth, he was tight end 7 yards per run last year. He was 7th in receiving grade last year. As a rookie, he was 9th in receiving grade. The issue is that he didn't really score a lot of points last year. He had less points per game last year than he had as a rookie. but he can definitely bounce back. Like when we look at his numbers, he became much more of a downfield receiving threat, which was really interesting last year. He went from 79 targets to 98 targets, so he was commanding more targets on like a per snap, per route basis. And then his yards per reception went from 8.3 to 11.6, and his air yards went from 398 to 849. So he was much more of a downfield receiver, which will give you a lot of upside, but he didn't have the receiving touchdowns. He only had 2, which is pretty crazy after having 7 the year before. If you had like 63 for 732 and like 7 touchdowns last year, he probably would have been just fine as a tight end. So that's kind of what you're hoping for. Maybe he scores more touchdowns this year. But it's tough to see him have like a massive, massive ceiling in this offense. Now, next up we have our high floor tight end 2s. And this is the range where I don't really see a path for these guys to become like huge league winners. But I would probably pair like a high floor tight end 2 with your upside tight end 2s in this next tier. And at tight end 11, first tight end and high floor tight end 2s is going to be Dalton Schultz. And Dalton Schultz very quietly has been the tight end 7 in points per game over the last 3 years. Now, it's large part due to being on the Cowboys, catching passes from Dak Prescott, but 10.4 points per game is only behind Kelsey, Andrews, Kittle, Waller, Hawkinson, and Goddard. It's ahead of Pitts, ahead of Freiermuth, ahead of Higbee, ahead of pretty much everybody else. And, I mean, I have him at tight end 11 right now. So there's only so much further I can put him below that. He goes to the Texans, where we're talking about being a top 2 target in an offense. I have to say, at the very least, he's going to be in the mix to be a top 2 target on this offense, right? You have a bunch of unproven wide receivers, but a lot of them, right? So like Nico Collins, Robert Woods, John Mechie. I'd say Schultz probably ends up second. I imagine one of those wide receivers kind of ascend, but I imagine Schultz kind of ends up second in targets. He gets to be kind of like that safety blanket for C.J. Stroud, who's kind of like has a similar play style to a guy like Dak Prescott. So you have C.J. Stroud, one of the best pure throwers when it comes to quarterback prospects. You have Dalton Schultz, who's going to kind of be a safety blanket in his rookie year. It's tough because the Texans offense isn't going to be amazing, right, because you have a rookie quarterback, but the target should be there. Schultz, to me, has a path. Like, of course, the ceiling isn't there, but he should be able to sort of, like, vacuum up enough targets that, he could be in the mix to be like a top 6 to 8 tight end this year. Like, we're in a really disgusting part of tight ends here. I'm trying to sell you guys on Dalton Schultz, but that's about all I got. Now, at tight end 12, we have Tyler Higbee, who's another one that's just absolutely disgusting. But Tyler Higbee was one of 4 tight ends with 100 or more targets last year. It was Travis Kelce, Mark Andrews, T.J. Hawkinson, Tyler Higbee. Your tight ends with 100 or more targets last year. He was the tight end 5 in expected points per game behind just Kelce, Hawkinson, Andrews, and Zach Ertz last year. The volume was there. The targets were there. It was just an awful offense. They didn't have Matthew Stafford down the stretch. The idea is here that there's really nobody else outside of Cooper Kupp. I mean, it's going to be Van Jefferson versus Tyler Higbee for second most targets in this offense. The defense is terrible, right? There's no Bobby. It is Aaron Donald and nobody, right? Bobby Wagner gone, Jalen Ramsey gone. Maybe they have to throw the ball more. Maybe Matthew Stafford is healthy this year, and if that's the case, then Tyler Higbee should pay off ADP. But again, he's one of these guys in the high floor tight end 2s where it's like I don't really see a path for him to be a top 5 tight end in fantasy, but the volume should be there on an offense that has featured him these past few years. Now, our last tight end in the high floor tight end 2s tier is Cole Kmet. I don't feel great about this one. I think you can, I might move Cole Kmet down, but for now I'll have him here. He was 8th among tight ends last year with a 19.3% target share, but he wasn't really great. I think he was outside the top, 15 tight ends in points per game. He was in a low-volume offense last year with Justin Fields. It's probably a low-volume offense again, but this is sort of a bet on the entire offense when it comes down to Cole Kmet, right? We're talking about tight end 13. If Justin Fields happened to be this year's Jalen Hurts, made a huge step forward in year 3, then Cole Kmet absolutely smashes and definitely comes with him, right? Where Cole Kmet last year, the games where Justin Fields went absolutely crazy through the air, he dragged Cole Kmet with him. I think week 9 and week 10, Cole Kmet had back-to-back 20-plus point weeks. He had 3 15-plus point games all season, which was 5th behind just Travis Kelce, Kittle, Andrews, and Hawkinson. So he sort of flashed that ceiling on a week-to-week basis. It's a matter of sort of putting it together over an entire year, which is going to be tough unless if Justin Fields takes that big step forward. Now, at tight end 14, first of our upside tight end 2s, who, I mean, you can kind of put all these guys in the same tier, but I would just rather, these are more of your high floors, and these are more your shooting for ceiling. Greg Dulcich is a second-year tight end. He could be this year's like Albert O, where we sort of like are chasing a young guy and he just doesn't perform. You also have a lot of sort of, pushing against the grain, I would call it, from Denver, where they are acquiring Adam Troutman. There was like a Sean Payton quote saying he doesn't really know, pretty much that he's unfamiliar with Greg Dulcich's game, if you will. But Greg Dulcich is a guy I want to bet on because with tight ends, there's two ways you can get efficiency, one being yards after the catch, the other being ADOT. And Greg Dulcich is an unathletic guy, so yak was never really a thing for him, but he had a 100th percentile ADOT last year, 12.7 yard ADOT. He's somebody that's going to be lining up in the slot, out wide, being used as not an inline tight end, which is what we want. He already sort of had an established rapport with Russell Wilson last year. His 8.6 points per game was enough for like tight end 17, which is pretty damn good as a rookie. And that target per route run, 16.1%, isn't terrible. It's not amazing, but we know receivers, right, tight ends and wide receivers, their target per route run, their target share usually sees a big improvement in year two. So if that target per route run goes up and that ADOT holds firm, Greg Dulcich pretty easily can become like a top 12 tight end in fantasy without much resistance. You also have Russell Wilson potentially bouncing back, right? If Sean Payton comes in and Russell Wilson can, be anything of what he used to look like, then Greg Dulcich should be one of the primary beneficiaries of that bounce back. Now, the last guy we'll talk about here, tight end 15, is Dalton Kincaid. And I still have a really hard time pressing the button on him. We just know, historically, rookie tight ends for fantasy, it's not a great bet. But when we talk about Dalton Kincaid, he's kind of the exception to the rule, right? He was drafted in the first round. He's attached to Josh Allen. He was the, what do you want to call it? The quintessential receiving tight end coming out of school this year as a guy who ran 48.8% of his career routes out of the slot. So he was a guy that wasn't sitting, hand in the dirt in line. He's moving out, across the formation, playing out wide, playing in the slot, running wide receiver routes, which when you combine that with a Josh Allen offense, the upside is certainly there. A 10-plus touchdown ceiling is there in this offense, but as a rookie tight end, there's a scenario out there where Dawson Knox outperforms him in year one. Dawson Knox is the tight end one in snaps for like the first 8 games of the season. You have to pair Kincaid with somebody else. So a lot of ways that things can go wrong, but it is a nice high upside bet. Now, I will say some honorable mentions here. Tight end 16, I have Chigo Okonkwo as an upside tight end too. Per route stuff looks great, but it's a little bit dangerous in seasonal to like extrapolate per route stats like we're doing with Chigo Okonkwo, but I think he's a talented player. I just don't know when we'll see him actually produce fantasy points. Then you have Juwan Johnson, converted wide receiver to tight end. Was really good down the stretch last year. Should probably be involved again. And then Gerald Everett. Chargers did nothing to address their tight ends. Often should be electric with Kellen Moore. Gerald Everett should probably mix in and be a back-end tight end 1 this year that you could probably start on a weekly basis. So those are my 3 honorable mentions in the upside tight end 2 tier. These are your entire top 15 tight end rankings for fantasy football. As always, if you enjoyed, make sure you go down below, subscribe, leave a like, and if you want access to the entire list of rankings, if you are a sicko out there and you want my top, I think I did like my top, what did I do? I did my top 30 tight ends, my top 30 quarterbacks, my top 65 running backs, my top 90 wide receivers. If any of that sounds interesting to you, I also just did my Dynasty Rankings update. That's on the Patreon, patreon.com/Ron Stewart. My top 300 Dynasty Rankings, my player recommendations, buy-sell recommendations, all in there. Probably going to be making videos about the Dynasty Rankings this week. We'll probably do like a skyrocketing video, maybe a trade target video, maybe a falling down the rankings video. I also want to look through my teams and kind of get everything figured out for what I want to do with my Dynasty teams before the season starts. So be on the lookout for that. We'll have some Dynasty content this week. I know some guy came in my live stream last night and was complaining about I wasn't posting enough Dynasty content. Expect Dynasty content this week. As always, I will see you guys in the next one.
Stones, like this froze, ice cold, ice around my body like I'm